The transatlantic slave trade, or the Atlantic trade, was and will forever be one of the darkest times in human history. From the brutal capturing and selling of African people, to locking them in horrid, inhuman dungeons, to exporting them like cargo across oceans for hard labor. It was a cycle of pain, cruelty, and greed. This is the raw, untold story of that horror. A story of betrayal, profit, and unimaginable suffering. A story of how African kingdoms and European empires together fueled a nightmare. The transatlantic slave trade had three brutal stages. First, goods like guns, alcohol, and metal items were shipped from Europe to Africa. Second, Africans were captured, sold, and exported from Africa to the Americas. Third, raw materials, sugar, cotton, tobacco, were sent from the Americas to Europe. That was the triangle, a cycle of suffering that made millions for the empires of Europe. The transatlantic slave trade began in the early 16th century and went on till the 19th century. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the French, the Spanish, on exploring and discovering the new world which is the Americas. These empires, hungry for power, needed cheap labor for their new colonies in the Americas. Africa, with its strong people and diverse kingdoms, became their target. Don't get it wrong, African kingdoms did live in harmony, but they were also divided by ethnicity, culture, and power. And like any powerful groups, they sometimes went to war. Back then, prisoners of war were held, but they weren't seen as slaves. Prisoners of war was a totally different thing from enslavement. Prisoners of war could marry, own land, even become part of the captor's family. Prisoners weren't treated as commodities and weren't maltreated or abused. When the European demand for enslaved Africans grew, so did the hunger, not just in Europe, but within Africa itself. Powerful kingdoms saw an opportunity to grow stronger, richer, more feared. So they turned their swords, not against colonizers, but against their own neighbors. Suddenly, a prisoner became a product. Suddenly, capturing people became a business. The Oyo Empire, present-day Nigeria, mounted military campaigns deep into the interior. Villages were set ablaze, men butchered, survivors, men, women, children, chained and marched to the coast. The kingdom of Dahomey, now Benin, became infamous for its brutal slave raids, especially the Agogie, which was an all-female military unit. They built a kingdom powered by blood. Kings like Agaja and Geso proudly led slave raids, capturing thousands, selling them in exchange for guns, alcohol, and foreign luxuries. Dahomey became so dependent on the trade that when the British tried to suppress it in the 1800s, the king refused. He said stopping the slave trade would destroy his kingdom's economy. In the Gold Coast, the Asante Empire, now Ghana, grew rich and mighty, conquering rival states like Denkira, Fonte, Akyem, and others, capturing and selling their enemies to European merchants. And in return, they received guns, gunpowder, cannons, power. But this power came at a price, a deadly price. Entire regions were destabilized, alliances collapsed. Communities that once coexisted turned into mortal enemies. The Kingdom of Congo, now Angola and the Congo regions, Nupe, Borgu, Mambundu, and more kingdoms, all got pulled into this expanding web of blood trade. The wars never stopped. Raids became constant. Trust between tribes vanished. Imagine this: a child asleep in a hut, woken in the dead of night. Flames outside, screams in the distance, armed warriors storming in. Her mother grabbed, her father stabbed. She's dragged away in chains, sold by a neighboring kingdom that once shared food with her people. Some African warlords became so wealthy from selling slaves that they began living like European nobles, wearing imported silks, drinking foreign wine, building palaces on the backs of their own people's suffering. But not every African participated. Not all kingdoms were involved. Some resisted, some hid runaway slaves, some refused to sell their people, no matter the price. But those who didn't trade became targets, and those who did just kept feeding the fire. Middlemen also emerged, Africans who didn't raid, but bought and sold those already captured. Some helped Europeans with logistics, guiding them, translating, even raiding together with them. Because when gold is replaced with guns, and war becomes business, peace dies. The continent bled, not just from European greed, but from African betrayal, and what was once a land of harmony became a battlefield of brothers turned enemies. Men, women, and even children were bound together in chains, neck to neck, wrist to wrist, and driven like cattle. They were forced to march, barefoot over harsh terrain, through forests, rivers, rocky paths, burning heat, sometimes in heavy rain, for hundreds of miles, from deep in the interior to the coastal slave forts. It wasn't a walk, it was a death march. They were given little to no food, no water for days, and those who collapsed, those too weak to move on, were whipped, beaten until they stood, or until they died. The dead were not buried, they were left behind, lying face down in the dirt, like discarded animals. The strong were forced to keep moving, stepping over the corpses of their own, mothers separated from their babies, husbands from wives, tribes scattered and shattered, their identities erased with each brutal step. The march could last weeks, sometimes months. Some never saw the ocean. They died in chains long before the ships ever came. Those who survived the death march didn't find relief. They were shoved through the iron gates of European slave forts along the coast, Elmina, Cape Coast, Goree Island, cold stone monuments to centuries of human suffering. There, they were thrown into dark, damp dungeons. No light, no air, no escape. Cramped together in suffocating spaces, hundreds packed like cargo, stacked like objects, left to rot. No toilets. Just human waste covering the stone floors. No food, only scraps thrown like trash, if any. No water, no rest, no hope. The stench of sweat, feces, vomit, rot, and blood filled the air. A thick, choking fog that clung to their skin. Many fell sick, many died. Their bodies weren't removed. They rotted in place, beside the living. Women and girls were dragged out at night, raped by soldiers, by merchants, by officers, screams in the dark. Men were chained, whipped, beaten for resisting, or simply for existing. And in the corners of these dungeons, children cried for their mothers, cried in fear, cried until their voices were hoarse, then silent. These were not holding rooms. They were hell chambers, designed to break the body and crush the soul. This was just the beginning. Then came the branding. Hot iron on skin, a mark of ownership burned into their bodies. Then the door of no return, the last step before being loaded onto ships, never to see home again. The middle passage, the journey across the Atlantic, was pure hell. Men were chained below deck, cramped, breathless. Women were raped, sometimes pregnant, sometimes forced to give birth on board. Children starved, buckets overflowed with urine, vomit mixed with sweat and blood. The sick lay with the dead. They were fed once a day, sometimes not at all. Some refused to eat and were force-fed with metal devices. Some jumped into the sea because they believed death was better than slavery. Of the 12.5 million Africans forced onto ships, over 2 million died during the Middle Passage. Disease, starvation, despair. Those who survived were auctioned like cattle, worked to death on plantations, mentally broken, physically scarred. After centuries of suffering, resistance, and relentless struggle, a slow wave of abolition began to rise. In 1703, Denmark and Norway became the first to ban the transatlantic slave trade, a quiet beginning, but it marked a turning point. Then in 1804, a spark turned into fire. Haiti, the only successful slave revolution in history, abolished slavery through force, led by those who had once been enslaved. A black republic born in blood and bravery. In 1707, Britain, one of the biggest traffickers, finally outlawed the trade. The U.S. followed a year later, in 1808, banning the importation of enslaved people. France, after abolishing and reinstating slavery several times, ended the trade again in 1818. Brazil, the last major slave trading country in the Americas, abolished the transatlantic trade in 1850. These were victories, hard-won and overdue, but freedom was not immediate, and it was not universal. Even as countries banned the trade, slavery itself remained legal for decades. On plantations, in homes, in fields, with black bodies still held in chains, and in some places, slavery never truly ended. In Mauritania, slavery wasn't officially abolished until 1981 and wasn't criminalized until 2007. Even today, modern slavery persists in many forms: forced labor, human trafficking, sexual exploitation. Abolition was not a finish line, but the beginning of another fight for justice, for repair, for truth. The legacy of slavery still lives, but so does the spirit of resistance, and that will never be broken. This history is not just African history, not just black history. It is human history. a wound still healing, a truth still ignored. We owe it to the millions who suffered, to speak their names, to tell their stories, and to never forget. This was the transatlantic slave trade.